At the age of 6 years old, I went to spend the weekend with my Aunt Evelyn. Now, before this, I had mostly seen her at Christmas. As we unwrapped the presents, she would stick the plastic gift wrapping bows to the top of her head until the collection resembled some kind of avant-garde hat. I'd sit on her lap and she'd pretend like her legs were the agitator in a washing machine and I was the pile of clothes. "Get ready for the spin cycle," she'd shout. Aunt Evelyn was fun. So there I was, my suitcase packed to spend a weekend with her in the little house nestled between converging hills deep in rural Indiana. The rain was just beginning when my parents dropped me off, and I could hear the rumble of thunder in the distance. From the shadows of the creeper vines that covered the front porch, Aunt Evelyn emerged. "Hello, Sugar Pop," she said, and then she cackled like a friendly witch. Aunt Evelyn's house had everything. An endless supply of sugar-laden breakfast cereals, which she cheerfully fed me for dinner, along with Pop-Tarts and cookies. Pictures of Jesus and Elvis painted on black velvet that glowed when lit with the attached black lights. Towering stacks of china purchased at garage sales, shoved into every corner, and which she encouraged me to use the plates as frisbees. A collection of scratched record albums included one called The World's Greatest Marches, and wearing our bathrobes and carrying large wooden spoons, Aunt Evelyn and I marched up and down her living room, playing musical chairs with the dozens of mismatched chairs that filled the little house. After we'd finally fallen, breathless, onto the squeaky sofa, I asked her why she had so much stuff. "Because, Sugar Pop," she said, leaning in and looking deep into my eyes, "you never know when doomsday is coming." This should have been my first clue, but I was only 6. By the time I went to bed, thunder and lightning crashed and crackled across the night sky, but it was way past my usual bedtime and I was too tired to care. A few hours later, Aunt Evelyn woke me. "Get up," she said, shaking me and rattling all those china plates that littered the floor. "Get up! It's the end of the world." She took me to the window and there, by the light of the moon, pointed to the bottom of the rain-slicked hills that surround us. "See," she said, "the water is getting higher and higher, and soon God will wash us away altogether." Now I looked, but all I could see was the expected puddles of not much else. "We're doomed, Sugar Pop," she said, this time her voice hopeless, her eyes full of tears. So there I was at 6, doing my best to comfort her, but nothing I said seemed to get through. Over and over she kept saying, "I knew this day would come. I knew this day would come." Now, despite my Aunt Evelyn's joyful exterior, clearly there was a certainty deep within her that she had been waiting for something bad to happen, something devastating. Now, it's no wonder really that it's a big flood that would be one of Aunt Evelyn's greatest fears. After all, in many cultures we find a flood story. Noah and the Ark, Gilgamesh, Panu. These stories were a way for ancient people to understand, make some kind of sense of why bad things happen. And so common to these stories was this theme that a deity or deities sends down a great flood to just wash away all civilization as an act of divine retribution. And clearly that night, my Aunt Evelyn believed that God's wrath had come down on us all. But when I think of all the potential for bringing joy into people's lives that she had, I mourn the loss of that spiritual energy wasted on waiting for the flood. Now, I think as Unitarian Universalists, we sometimes think we are we are beyond, or maybe even above, this kind of thinking. After all, we have our universalist heritage, which says a loving God is not a destructive God. And we have the heir to our Unitarian heritage, scientific rationality, which teaches us another way of understanding a rainstorm. And yet, we are still surrounded by mystery. We don't know why some bad things happen. And we have no certainties. We have no real certainties on the big questions of why we're here and what it all means. So it's no wonder that sometimes a little bit of my Aunt Evelyn, just a little bit, can live inside all of us. That flood myth is common to so many cultures because there's something primal we respond to in it. This idea of our own destruction or disaster. And if you don't believe me, look at the proliferation of dystopian literature out in the world today. All these books about this bleak future where people have to fight to death on reality shows, or all the TV shows and movies about zombies, the sort of worst case scenario of what humanity could be. So the question for me is, what is there in the human psyche that makes us kind of obsessed with or wait for these kind of disaster situations? And I think the answer really is, it's because disasters really do happen. People experience disaster, job loss, financial trouble, marital trouble, addiction, loss from death, and on and on and on. And I know there are people right now who are dealing with those difficult situations. And sometimes there's a lot we can do to make things better. And sometimes there's very little, at least initially, like true unstoppable catastrophe happens, like an incurable illness, hurricane, a tsunami. Speaking of tsunamis, I'm reminded of a story from Japan and that tsunami a few years ago, and a man named Masahiro Kazamatsu. And at the time of the story, Mr. Kazamatsu, 76 years old, and an ordinary man by his own definition. And I love stories about ordinary people. So there he is that day, watching, horrified on the television, as during his daughter's usual work shift, the airport she works at is literally engulfed in a tidal wave, leaving it completely underwater. Now he's miles from there, so you can imagine he starts calling and calling and calling her cell phone, but there's no answer. And hours pass, and a day passes, and friends start saying, look, you've got to face the fact, she's gone. But he doesn't believe that. He won't believe it yet. And so Mr. Kazamatsu, despite the warnings that he will never make it through the mud and the water and the chaos and the debris, he gets in his car and sets off for what should be a half-day's journey to this airport, but what will ultimately take him 5 days and 5 nights. At times the roads are almost impassable, but somehow he finds a way, even though he has to dodge unspeakable things at every turn. But then finally the car gets stuck in the mud. But you know what? It's out of gas at this point. There's nowhere to refill the tank. So Mr. Kazamatsu, 76 years old, he climbs out of the car, down into the floodwater, still miles and miles from this airport, and he begins to walk. And he walks through the mud and the water and the debris. And he says, my daughter may be just one amongst so many dead. But my hope is that she is alive. And with each step I take, this is my prayer. And so on and on he walks, through that mud, through that debris, through that water, until finally he reaches the airport, which is still submerged. And he's directed to an emergency center where there are crowds and crowds of disoriented people. Face after face is unfamiliar. He spends hours there, but he doesn't give up. And finally, guess what? There she is. In shock, disoriented, hungry, but ready to go home with her father. So for Mr. Kazumatsu, there was something within him that said it was worth trying. It was worth trying to journey through this flood to save his daughter. Now contrast that with my Aunt Evelyn the night of the big storm, when her fear left her understandably immobilized. And I say understandably because I think it's easier for us to give in to the fear all around us, to have so much dread for what may occur that we feel like trying to solve problems is futile. And yet we Unitarian Universalists, I believe, are called to move beyond that way of thinking. Because at our core, there is something that today I will call optimism. Now, I'm a realist in a lot of ways, so I am going to just get this out of the way. I think that we all know optimism can be kind of a dirty word. There's a sort of glib optimism out there that has made a bad name for itself, and it's understandable. I mean, I know a lot of us have probably been in a situation of great loss or crisis, and you've had someone come up to you and say, oh, Joan, just look for the silver lining, it's all fine, and you just think that's no help at all, right? That doesn't really help my situation. And so that kind of glib optimism, those folks who are oblivious to the practical realities of problem solving, that's not what I'm talking about today. And that's created 1,000 jokes you can find on the internet about optimists. And I'll share one with you because I think it sort of sums it all up. How many optimists does it take to screw in a light bulb? Anybody have any idea? You know it's either one end of the spectrum or the other. It's none. They just sit around waiting for the power to come back on. So that's what we are not as Unitarian Universalists. We are what I will call practical, or realistic, practical optimists. We believe that in the potential for humanity to make things better, but we also don't ignore criticisms, we don't ignore problems, we don't ignore rationality in the process. And so that choice to call ourselves optimists is an informed one, which makes it all the more powerful. Now, we know that studies in neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to grow and change, have shown that positive thought actually creates new matter in the brain, which can lead to better health, longer life, a greater sense of well-being. Now, some religious perspectives are pretty pessimistic, really, about this world. They're focused solely on an afterlife and believe that this world is basically an unredeemable place, but not us. Not us. Built into the core of our faith is optimism, for we believe we can affect change in the world, that it's worth trying. And guess what? As we all know, history has proven us correct again and again, from Susan B. Anthony's work with women's rights to Thomas Starr King's work here in California, and not just big names. It's all the people over the years who worked for racial and marriage equality and social justice, people in this congregation. Our successes are rarely, if ever, immediate, but we've learned to see small victories as precursors of larger change. And that vision, that ability to have that broader vision, that makes us optimists. So that's all very well. I know some of you are probably saying, but seriously, Jason, how do we deal with the fear that we have of what may come? After all, life literally throws stuff our way that makes no sense. I think the answer sounds simple, but its implications are profound. To manage fear, we must have faith in something. To manage fear, we must have faith in something. Now again, for another religious perspective, that faith might be located primarily out of this world, but our faith is engaged and intertwined with this world, albeit with a healthy appreciation for the awe and wonder of the vast and mysterious universe out there. So when we ground ourselves in an optimistic community like this one that believes the world is capable of changing for the better, one that believes that humanity leans toward good, one that believes that the arc of the universe bends toward justice, then we create a foundation that is strong for ourselves, even amid storms. As we, in community, practice looking, especially when times are manageable, looking for the potential for good, it makes it easier and easier to see that good when the bad has the temporary upper hand. But again, I will say, I know that is easier said than done. If we could all just do it, we would. But I can share with you a few years ago that I really felt like I was possibly losing that sense of my own optimistic self. My mother-in-law at that point was terminally ill, and her condition left her with a laundry list of medical problems, including she couldn't walk anymore, there was severe dementia, and so we were all in this situation trying to care for her. It was devastating her finances, it was devastating ours, and that was, if the emotional turmoil didn't just do us all in first. So one morning I went over to her house to relieve my brother-in-law, who, this was very early in the timeline, he was caring for her, and he needed to do some errands. And I'll tell you, I will confess that I think my biggest fear at that point was having to help her with intimate things, like going to the bathroom. And I think it was because, looking back, it would just make the situation so real for me in a way that I wasn't ready to deal with. So that was my big fear, but I get to her house, and my brother-in-law says, look, she sleeps, I'm going to be gone an hour. She sleeps this time every morning. She's going to sleep the entire time I'm gone. So you can probably anticipate what's coming, right? So he was right, she did sleep, but it was only for about 15 minutes. And then she woke up, and she was angry, she was confused, and of course, she was demanding to be taken then and there to the bathroom. Nothing I said could persuade her to change her mind. So, with a lot of sweating and straining, because she outweighed me by several pounds, I managed to lift her off the bed and then get her into the wheelchair, but not without first a very gentle but unexpected detour down to the floor for the two of us. We just sort of sat down there and talked for a minute. So I got her settled into the bathroom, and there I was, standing kind of angled away from her, but trying to give her a bit of privacy, but still standing close in case I was needed, and sweat was pouring down my face, and I truly was, the image is, I was up to floodwater about this deep. This was my own personal storm that I was in. And I'll never forget what happened next. From out of that haze of confusion, her face cleared for just a moment, and with this sort of casual tone, like a consummate hostess inviting someone into her parlor, she gestured to the wheelchair, which stood just a few feet from where she sat on the toilet, and said, "Have a seat." So for a moment, there's no dementia there, just eyes that are twinkling like they had before, in acknowledgement of the absurdity of this grim situation the two of us found ourselves in. So here I am, and I burst out laughing, and she laughs with me, and then that veil of confusion dropped back over her face again. But I'll tell you, it hit me in that moment. Here I was in my own, worst fear, drowning really in this floodwater, and I'd been able to have a moment of connection with another human being that brought me back to who I was. And this was with someone who had her own profound challenges. But in that moment, I was able to reconnect with that sense of optimism, even though I didn't know what the future held, and even though I didn't know, and I still don't know, why this terrible thing had happened to someone that I love. So when things are bleak, and they are, let's face it, we have to find That thing, those moments that connect us back to who we are as essentially optimistic people, and we grab hold of them like life rafts. And we hold on, at least until the next one comes along. And you know what? If we haven't been practicing looking for the potential for good in a community like this one, if we don't have that support, sometimes those moments just sail by us unnoticed, and they leave us there in that floodwater. So it's essential that we make a practice of taking action that reflects our belief that this world is capable of changing for the better. And it could be anything. Anything, the Just at Your Table program we talked about today. It can be doing outreach programs here at the church, social justice programs. It might be cultivating a daily spiritual practice like meditation for yourself. Or it could be a simple practice out in the world like trying to say kind words to people who look like they could use it. Like that, person who looks unhappy, the clerk at the market. And maybe that means she goes home and interacts with her family in a more positive way. And maybe that means that they go out into the world and do better things than they would have done, and so on and so on. Like a pebble just tossed into a placid pond, our actions have the possibility of creating ever-widening circles of change and transformation. And if that makes me sound like an optimist, so be it. As you know, I claim it. And yet, at the end of all of this, we are left with the knowledge that there are some questions we just can't answer. We don't know why storms wreak havoc in one neighborhood and leave another unscathed. We don't know why some of these things happen in life. We can't explain them all. And I think, though, ultimately, that's one of the most wonderful and awful and awesome and frightening and reassuring things about life. It's full of mystery. Every time we learn something more about this vast and glorious universe, more questions emerge. I would say the space between stars isn't just distance. It's velvety, dark mystery, so great, so unknowable, and full of such possibility that no wonder it sometimes fills us with fear. But if we can trade our fear for awe, if we can celebrate what we know and what we don't know, and if we can cling to each other amidst the uncertainty, then in its way, it will be all right. And with all this talk of possibility, it shouldn't surprise us then that my Aunt Evelyn, the woman who believed the sun would never rise after that storm, changed profoundly over the years. She went through some hard times, but she survived and found new strength she didn't know she had. Now when you ask her why she has all that secondhand china and all those chairs, instead of answering that she's waiting for doomsday, she says, "Well, Sugar Pop, you never know when you're going to have a great big party, and you can always use some extra plates." May we all learn to weather the storms that come our way, no matter how far away the break in the clouds. And may we hold tightly to those we love as we turn toward the incomprehensible wonder of the sunrise.